Tonight, we're in the borders town of Kelso. Our venue this evening is the Art Deco Tate Hall, opened in 1933. 51 years ago this very week, it played host to an upcoming band called Genesis. They got into trouble for letting off pyrotechnics on stage. Will there be fireworks this evening? Let's find out. Welcome to Debate Night. Debate Night is the only show in Scotland giving you the chance to put your questions to the people in power, answering them on our panel this evening. From the Scottish Conservatives, Rachel Hamilton, MSP for Ettrick, Roxburgh and Berwickshire. Rachel is also the party spokesperson for Rural Affairs and the Islands. A former expert in the science of soil management and crop production, she now runs a hotel with her husband in nearby St Boswells. Dave Duggan is the SNP MP for Angus and the party spokesperson for energy security and net zero. Dave entered politics after working as a military helicopter engineer at the Ministry of Defence and was elected to Westminster 4 years ago. From Scottish Labour, Daniel Johnson is MSP for Edinburgh Southern and the party spokesperson for economy, business and fair work. Daniel previously ran his family's retail business and he's now the deputy convener of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. Also joining us this evening, the chair in international history at the University of Strathclyde, Professor Tanya Bulteman. Founder of the EU Citizens Champion campaign, Tanya specialises in migration and diaspora history and campaigns for post-Brexit citizens' rights. And finally, one of the most substantial figures in Scottish cultural life, according to The Times, award-winning writer and historian Alistair Moffat. Alistair was raised in Kelso and has held a number of roles, including director of programmes at STV, director of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, the rector of St Andrews University and founder of the Borders Book Festival as well. Please welcome them all to Debate Night. And of course, welcome to our studio audience. It's great to be back with you in Kelso tonight. And you can join in the discussion from home, wherever you are in Scotland. BBCDN is the hashtag you need on social media. And our Debate Night podcast will also be available for you to download straight after this broadcast. So let's get started. Our first question of the night comes from Douglas Taylor. Douglas, good evening. Good evening, panel. Rosebank, yes or no? Simple question. Douglas, thank you very much. We heard today that new licences for the Rosebank field have been approved. Oil production will start within the next 3 years. Dave Duggan, SNP spokesperson for energy security, net zero, Rosebank, yes or no?
Well, as I think Douglas might know, it's not that simple. Rosebank is going to go ahead. That field will be exploited for oil and gas.
Is that the right decision?
It's an inevitable decision, and that decision is a consequence of where we are in terms of our transition to net zero, which is, the answer to that is not where we should be. So what we can't do is cut the link between oil and gas services jobs and renewable energy jobs. And the way to cut that link is to turn the tap off straight away and cut production. Those jobs will wither on the vine and they won't be there to transition just or otherwise. So it's absolutely essential that we achieve three things. One is to protect those jobs, one is to secure energy security, but one is not to lose sight of our transition to net zero. And I'm afraid the UK government has lost sight on that third point, the transition to net zero.
Because this decision will protect thousands of jobs in your constituency.
It will protect hundreds of jobs in my constituency and thousands across the oil and gas services sector in Scotland. Or rather, Rosebank won't. It will have a contributing factor. But the fact is, we should be in a space where we are not developing future upstream developments in oil and gas. That's where we should be on the just transition. But we're not there. So we are forced into a situation that we develop a field like Rosebank. Now, I am equally as disappointed as Humza Yousaf, our First Minister. This should not be happening. But when you look at the landscape for engineering jobs in energy production in the northeast of Scotland and right across these islands, it is an inevitable consequence of inaction by the UK government that we are in this position. And I can see the link between the jobs that exist today and the outstanding expertise that exists in businesses across my constituency and elsewhere in Scotland. And we need to make sure that that very fragile link between oil and gas production and service jobs doesn't break on our journey towards net zero. But this is a question of pace. Now, Equinor is state-owned. It's a state-owned Norwegian oil company. It's an apex oil company. And so I'm pleased that they're committed to investing £2 in renewables for every £1 they invest in oil and gas in Scottish waters. But isn't it interesting that it's fallen to the Norwegian state oil company to develop legacy oil fields in the Scottish sector, rather than a Scottish state-owned oil company or even a UK state-owned oil company?
Douglas, I can't work out if that was a yes or a no, but we'll have another go in just a second. Gentleman in the front row down here.
Sorry, you said about energy security, but are we not paying global prices for that energy?
Yeah. So oil and gas is priced on a global market, but it's not just about the price that you pay for that, it's about the availability. We've seen the shock that the European gas sector endured, thankfully not the UK, although we endured those price shocks. We didn't have to sustain and plan and mitigate for the potential of actually running out of gas, thanks very much to the North Sea.
Hamza Yousaf just says this is the wrong decision. Why don't you just say that?
Well, it is the wrong decision, but the circumstances which have forced this decision have been that inaction has happened previously. So we should not, Hamza Yousaf's absolutely right, we should not be developing major upstream oil and gas
So it's a
production.
no. It's a no is the answer to the question.
But we have to, otherwise we will break the link between the offshore oil and gas services and onshore oil and gas services that exist now and the ones that we'll need.
The man in the front row is shaking his head here.
Well, we're already behind, as you said, so this isn't going to solve any issues. If we're paying global prices across the board, we're not going to be any better off.
The only people saying that your energy bills will get cheaper by exploiting Scottish oil and gas is the Tory government.
Right, well, let me speak to the Conservative on a panel here about this. Caroline Lucas, Green MP, says this is the greatest act of environmental vandalism in her lifetime. Rachel Hamilton.
No, I completely agree with the decision today on Rosebank. I disagree with both left and right here, SNP and Labour, who are saying no. They're saying no to protecting jobs in the northeast. I mean, we've got, a lot of jobs. We've got about 100,000 jobs in the northeast that we are protecting. And Dave Dugan actually makes a really good point, because he says that to do this, to invest in and open up this new oil field, will actually protect jobs. And that is what Gary Smith, on behalf of the unions, has said today. It's really important that we go to the transition, but we just don't fall off a cliff edge. And those people that will be working on Rosebank are the people who have the skills, the experience and the knowledge to be able to transfer to the new green renewable jobs that we need. We also need this investment because the companies that will move us towards renewables will invest in the carbon technology, the carbon capture and storage and other renewables that will be important to get to this stage that we need to. There's been no rowback on meeting net zero targets, which are a statutory requirement by 2050. This is a really important position. And I just want to say, again, agreeing with Dave Dugan on kind of market forces, we don't know when this oil field will open. We don't also know...
Well, three years, they're saying the first oil will come on
well,
flow.
We don't know what the market price will be down the line when this oil becomes available. We found ourselves in a situation where we had an illegal invasion by Putin of Ukraine. We found ourselves in a very difficult position.
But we're also living in a climate emergency. Isn't that a difficult position?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. And I totally am committed as a politician to meet the targets, the statutory targets that we have in place to meet net zero by 2050. That is a really important target. There's been no rowing back. This is just a stepping stone. Can I also just say...
No, you can't, because I want to hear from the gentleman with the beard and the glasses on the end there. On you go.
What you're saying, obviously, I understand we're still using petrochemicals at the minute, and in the future we will need it in the future, but hopefully we scale it down. But for example, wasn't there meant to be a big, huge carbon capture happening at the north of Scotland, and then it got canned?
No, it's happening.
Yeah.
Acorn project's happening.
Finally.
It's absolutely 100% happening in the northeast. And again, that is that carbon storage project to ensure that the jobs and livelihoods in the northeast are protected. Just going back to our situation where Ukraine was invaded by Putin, at that time we were importing gas from Russia Now, that is no stability for this country. If in time we decided, or the UK government decided, that we wanted to purchase our domestic fossil fuel oil from this country, then we could do so. But it makes sure that we have energy security.
Okay.
And I think that's really important.
Lady with the glasses on the end. On you go.
Rosebank, no. The planet must come first. It's on fire. It's burning. And our young people deserve a future. They need to be trained all over this country to provide the technicians who are going to build renewable energy resources that we will rely on, and it's only with those that we will get energy security and we will help resolve the difficulties of our precious planet.
Thank you. Daniel Johnson from Scottish Labour. The question is, Rosebank, yes or no?
No, and for exactly the reasons that the lady in the audience just set out. Look, the way we put these jobs, as Dave Dugan correctly points out, there's almost 100,000 jobs in the North Sea with an average wage of £45,000. You know, we can't overstate how important that contribution is to the economy, but the way you put them at risk is by not having a plan for the transition, by not investing in renewables. And Scotland has a real possibility of becoming a world leading in technologies such as floating offshore. But simply carrying on as we've done before with new oil and gas is not the way to do that.
Well,
which is why Labour has a plan.
Hang on, Daniel, tell that to Gordon Brown, who tonight has told Robert Peston, I think it's the right decision. The Labour and the Conservatives both support it. Because as long as we're on a trajectory to cut the use of carbon, then we'll have to have oil, and it will either come from Saudi Arabia or somewhere around here, or from the North Sea, and for balance of payment and other reasons, it'll be better to come from here. Gordon Brown thinks this is the right decision.
What we're talking about is a transition to net zero, not as
he thinks Rosebank is the right decision.
And I think there is a marginal decision to be made about where that sits. Now, my understanding is that Rosebank is only economically viable because of current oil prices. I mean, it's a very marginal decision. So Gordon Brown has his opinion, and for once, I'm going to disagree with him. What we need to do is have an investment, a plan, which is what Labour will bring in with GB Energy, investing £28 billion a year by the middle of the next Parliament, and ensuring that we've just heard praise for Equinor, the Norwegian state-owned energy company. Why don't we have our own British state-owned energy company? And that's exactly what Labour would create, headquartered here in Scotland, creating 50,000 jobs, valuable jobs in the energy of the future, not the past.
OK, Rosebank, yes or no? Man on the front row.
Yes, I think the paradox of this is that if we want to get to a fossil-free future, fossil fuel-free future, try saying that, we're going to have to burn an awful lot of fossil fuels, and it may as well be domestic.
Thank you. And lady on the second row there. Yeah.
Yeah. Fundamentally, we need to have a balance and a secure supply of energy. We have no option except to go and open Rosebank, and I support that. But really, we have a nuclear power station at Torness that's closing down. We should be looking at nuclear, despite, and this is half the problem in Scotland. Torness and Hunterston supplied half of Scotland's electricity, and that is going to now come off grid very shortly, and that is what supplied industry. It wasn't renewables. We need a base load that is chuntering along, regularly supplying all our industry needs, and the renewables can fluctuate and utilise it then. But we need a steady source of supply. And fundamentally, we're flawed because we're throwing the nuclear option out the door.
Alistair Moffat, Rosebank, yes or no?
I think yes, and this is a daft laddie point here. When people talk about net zero, it's the zero they focus on, but I think you should think about the net.
Indeed.
And by 2050, we're still going to be burning fossil fuels, as you said, and there's no question about that. So why don't we, thinking about energy security and about the effect of the Ukraine war, why don't we develop our own fossil fuels so that we can meet this demand, because it will be a demand until 2050 and probably beyond. We're going to keep burning this stuff, so let's make our own.
But there is a critical point here about whether these additional fields are necessary for that, because the existing fields will continue to produce. They're not suddenly going to turn off. And right now, we export 80% of our gas and 60% of our oil. And that's based on the current production levels, the current fields. So I think there is a genuine question about, because that point is correct, we were going to be continuing to burn fossil fuels in the 2050s. We're also going to be extracting oil from the existing fields in the 2050s. So it's not binary in that way, and I think it's very questionable whether Rosebank is required in order to do exactly what you've just set out.
Tanya Boatman, Chris Packham, the environmentalist, has said today it's an act of war against life on Earth, this decision. What do you think?
I think it's perhaps unfortunate to describe something as an act of war from our perspective here, but if you think about people who live, say, on a low-lying island in the Maldives, you might have a very different perspective on this, and I think we do not appreciate that enough. I think we have a very privileged position on the climate emergency, and my view is that the Rosebank decision is wrong for that reason, because we are forgetting the bigger picture. This is about our energy supply, but it's also about chain reactions we might trigger with some of those choices. Coming from a sector where innovation is a pretty big thing in higher education, I think I know that we do have the capacity to be so much better than we currently are, and I really worry that some of these decisions being made, like this one on Rosebank, is just going to push the cliff edge around people's jobs and innovation further down the line, and I think that is very unhelpful indeed. I think we need to be much more ambitious in what we do, and that's my main concern with this decision. Are we just actually unambitioning ourselves? And frankly, I also think it is really incredible to think that the net zero target could be met by making the substantial changes.
Do you believe we can't make the target given the direction we're going in?
I believe we can't make
it. Has actually been factored in by the North Sea Energy Transition Group.
But you cannot
made this decision today. Yes, it has, and it's also been considered by the Climate Change Committee.
But I mean, the problem is, and I think we can actually agree on this, no committee, not in Germany, not in the UK, not anywhere, can predict all the little stones that might fall into place. So my view is we need to protect ourselves collectively as best as we can, and these decisions prevent ourselves from doing that. I live in Leith, a suburb part of Edinburgh, where there are a number of innovation centres. For instance, Nova Innovation, they do tidal wave energy. Why are we not exploring this more, given we are surrounded by water? I know there are things going on, but I think we are limiting ourselves. And if I may, if I may make one more point, maybe specifically as a German-born for once as well, I think that's shown to a degree, given the reaction following the Ukraine war, given the focus on that, which I actually think doesn't matter all that much for this question, but what's possible if there is a will? And I'm not saying that everything that happened there is the best case example. I really don't think it is. But if there is a political will, a lot more innovation can be pushed forward. But if that's not there, or if decisions like this one are made, I think that's not the case.
Okay, let me hear from some people in the audience. Man in the front row down here.
You're on about Rosebank, yes. I totally agree with that, by the way. But having worked within that sector and knowing what's coming from an industry point of view, you say there's 100,000 jobs at the moment in the Northeast. In 3 years' time, when Rosebank's going to be about to be up and running, you're not going to have 100,000 jobs. We're an old sector. It's all old guys like me that are in the sector, and we're all going to retire soon. And there's not enough young people coming in and being trained. Yet there's a severe lack of modern apprenticeships in that sector and other sectors for the energy sector as a whole. What are we going to do about that?
I guess another big challenge. And man on the centre aisle here. Yes.
I just wanted to follow on from Tanya's point. Why are so many brilliant renewable technology startups in Scotland having to look overseas for funding? Because there's so much great stuff going on, but it's not being funded.
Our next question is actually in this same space, so we might be able to answer that there. Please get involved in the discussion this evening. The hashtag is BBCDN on social media. So let's go to question 2 tonight, which comes from Bob Hope. Bob, where are you?
Yep.
Evening, Bob.
Good evening. Berwickshire is one of the most productive arable areas of Scotland. What takes priority, food production or battery energy storage?
Now, one of the fascinating things about debate night is when we travel around Scotland and we find these hot local issues here which will have repercussions for the rest of us in time. Now, this is about the battery energy storage site. There's a big one proposed for east of Kelso here, 3 others for across Ayrshire, Fife and Glasgow. This is to allow us to store power from renewable energy so it can be used when the wind is not blowing or the sun is not shining. Rachel Hamilton.
Yeah, thank you, Bob, for your question. I mean, this is a real live issue in the area of Eccles, Bergham and Leeton, which is really close to here. So we've got people in the audience who support looking at renewables, and obviously we've got a great offshore wind project in Eyemouth as well. And then we've got individuals who are sort of ensuring that they can turn the lights on with fossil fuels. But this particular battery storage project, Bob Hope is absolutely right to highlight that it could take away from prime agricultural land. Now, the Scottish Conservatives have, I'm in charge of the Rural Affairs portfolio for my party, and we've just written a paper on the importance of Scotland's food future, which is the agricultural bill will be published tomorrow. And we know that there's going to be changes, particularly to payments to farmers. We also know that we've got to feed the nation. So this question is incredibly important, is to how do we balance bringing renewables to an area, but actually in this case, on prime agricultural land, but also how do we say to areas, you need to have your fair share? Because in this particular situation, it seems as though there's applications coming left, right and centre.
Yeah,
and
Bob,
that is affecting communities.
Bob, tell us a little bit more about this, because, I mean, from the outside, we need to store this stuff. It's the missing link between us producing power through renewables and then being able to use it to keep the lights on. It sounds like a kind of classic NIMBY thing. Is that wrong?
It's very wrong. As a community council, we recognise the need for battery energy storage. There have been 3 applications which came through for using our fields. We did not oppose them, and we're looking forward to working with the developers to mitigate the impact of them in our area. However, once we've got the 3, and they're taking up about 80 acres between the actual battery energy storage and the extensions of the substation, that we feel that enough is enough, because our prime job in the borders is to produce food. And what we're not looking to have is the industrialisation of our area with battery energy storage.
Okay. What do these things look like, Bob? I mean, they're like shipping containers?
Yes, a couple of bits here. First of all, we're told that to develop a 25-acre field, it'll take about 2 years, and during that 2 years, up to 40 lorries per day will carry both concrete and gravel onto the site. That will be laid on the field. They will then put the containers on top. So you're talking about a field full of concrete and freight containers.
Okay.
The freight containers are all containing batteries, which in themselves are pretty volatile. And every other day we're hearing about chemical fires within them. However, the bit that really concerns me is that if you take 2 years to put concrete in, they will never be returned to the arable land that they were in the past.
Okay. And it's a particularly beautiful area, as we all experienced driving down here today. Gentleman with his hand up there.
Regarding what Bob was saying, there needs to be balance in the area, because if you just get loads of companies coming in, taking up all the land, but especially get some companies who will try and move near towns, all this should be kept in the one particular place near the substation, which is expanding itself. And basically, and all the communities in the area around it need to, because they're going to be living with it for the next 30, 40 years, for example.
Okay.
And they need to get benefits that will help everyone in the area to live with this.
Okay, Alistair Moffat, you've written a lot about the heritage of the landscape down here, but it has changed with wind farms, hasn't it? Is this part of the change?
The landscape has changed enormously over the past 3 or 4 centuries, and it's going to change again. I mean, surely, Bob, this is an issue of balance. You know, we've just been saying that we're facing a climate emergency. This is about frying the planet. This is about not being able to live here. This is the biggest existential threat the human race has ever faced, and we've got to deal with it. We've got to deal with it. So if we're losing 20 acres or 80 acres of lovely, beautiful arable Berkshire, where my family come from, then we're going to have to lose it. If it's about capturing the energy in these battery farms, then we've got to do it. We've got to act. And we're going to have losers and winners to some extent. There's no doubt about that. And I would hate to see, particularly near Leetham and Fogo and all these places, I would hate to see that kind of despoliation that you're talking about, you know, concrete fields and so on. But the planet's burning. It's burning. And like Tanya, I'm not optimistic. I'm not optimistic. I mean, the greatest polluters are the USA and China. They're the biggest economies. And so they're chucking out more carbon emissions than anybody. And we need global cooperation. These are global problems. We need global solutions. And part of the solution is to store energy in that way. And so I think there's a balance to be found. And I think it has to be found.
Oh, so many hands up in the audience on this. Man down there. Yes.
Thank you. This is not about what, it's about where. As Bob mentioned, the 3 applications that have now went ahead at the substation, they will represent 30% of the total capacity that's been applied for in Scotland in the last 4 years. With a further 2, that will take it to 45%.
So too much in one place.
All within 2 kilometres of a village of 161 people.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be this way.
Okay.
Co-location beside substations, beside solar farms, wind farms, just like there is now a predisposition to brownfield down in Westminster, that's the right way to go. Okay. Scotland has to put in appropriate guidance.
Thank you. Lady with the glasses up there. There you go.
Very fond of this area and know that Fogo very well. I used to live around there. I live somewhere else now, but near Kelso. One of the companies I used to work for was called a charity called the National Trust. And I used to put a building, lift in an 18th century building. But that key to doing that wasn't vandalism, it was reversibility. And putting loads and loads of concrete on good arable land is not the way forward. This is a brownfield site a project. It's not for arable land. We've got much better use for food security. It's a huge issue in this country. We've got much better use for this land.
Thank you. This feels like a good old-fashioned public meeting about battery energy storage. Dave Dugan.
So Bob's absolutely right, and so is the other contributor there. It's a question of proportionality and the avoidance of clustering. And actually that's not inconsistent with the actual requirements of a network that is not based around massive generation from coal or nuclear. It's exactly what's required from a network that in the future will be increasingly done by smaller, more renewable forms of electricity generation, including some very large arrays and hydro schemes, and nuclear will continue to be an element of power elsewhere on these islands. But the transition of energy will include a requirement for smaller, more granular networks within the overall grid. And that's why clustering isn't necessarily key to that. Clustering is usually a function, and I have a similar issue around Forfar and Lunan Head in my Angus constituency, where solar farms are clustering around those communities. And they're doing so because they can get access to the network, because it's one of very few substations on the network that has got spare capacity. We need to get beyond that, and we do that with investment in the network that avoids the developers of these types of battery storage schemes from clustering all in the same place.
So you're saying this should not go ahead here?
It's suboptimal. No, I'm not saying it shouldn't go ahead. I'm saying it shouldn't go ahead in a disproportionate amount that manifestly and with some degree of legacy changes the character and demeanour of an area. We have to, all of us, in all of our communities, shoulder the responsibility to host infrastructure that we probably otherwise wouldn't want, but that is going to help us get through the energy transition that our children and our children's children need us to have been responsible enough to deliver. But what we can't do is make certain communities across Scotland pay a far higher price for that in terms of local amenity than others. And battery storage is not the only way to smooth the peaks and troughs of generation. There's pump storage, there's ammonia, there's carbon capture, utilisation and storage, there's hydrogen generation. All of this demands focus and pace, and that's not what we're getting from the Department for Energy.
Lady in the check shirt there. Yeah.
We're not just in a climate crisis, we're also in a biodiversity loss crisis. And to transform good agricultural land where we're needing all the pollinators we have to ensure that we have constancy of food supply just seems inappropriate. You know, our ground nesting birds, our farmland birds, the farmland bird index, you look at these and there's so many species that are under threat, and I think that has to be given consideration as well.
Thank you. Tanya Boltman, this is probably something you've given no thought about until this evening, but what do you think?
Well, obviously listening to the contributions, I actually think this is a good example where there is a lot of agreement in the room. So let me just say that for once as well. You know, we have no, but I'm serious about this. I think we've lost the ability to have this sense of agreeing to disagree, or you know, that there isn't just noise about things, that we actually discuss something in a good way. And I think this is a good example of that, because everybody is in broad agreement of needing to take action, that maybe sometimes there is a balance requirement. But what I was really thinking as everybody made their contributions was, we seem to be looking at this very much in isolation. So for instance, the biodiversity point, which I think is a really important one, isn't just addressed by saving land here, it's also addressed by other actions we take, say in city centers, having pollinator field, sort of flower islands, things like that. And I don't think we look holistically enough at some of these questions. That's the first thing. But I would also secondly like to ask, what innovation is actually happening around this? Let me give you an example of what I mean. In Germany, a lot of farmers are also having to ask themselves the same sort of questions, but also about their own sustainability as farmers. So it's not just a question about the climate emergency. And I saw what I thought was a really fascinating report the other day about farmers essentially opening up old people's homes. It is designed to address an issue in Germany with having a lack in elderly care, but it's also designed to help the farmers kind of, get another income stream, essentially. So here we're giving away land to companies. They do this with it. But what are other solutions to some of these problems? How are farmers, owners of land being involved in some of them? Are there better ways? Now, battery storage, maybe it doesn't work in a different way, but certainly for solar farms, I know that there are some crop that actually can still grow underneath. Maybe not in Scotland, I don't know, I'm not too familiar with this, but I know there are some options for still using some of the land actually for its kind of normal purpose. So I guess my question back is then, as a non-expert on this, what are we doing around this? I don't think it's an either-or necessarily, and I think it would be better to have a more holistic approach to this.
Thank you. Daniel Johnson.
Yeah, well, look, first of all, can I just, put everyone at rest? The last thing a politician like me is going to do is come down from Edinburgh and make pronouncements on local planning issues. I think that's a thoroughly bad idea, so I'm not going to do that. But look, I think there's a broader point here, and actually, because I think what Dave said is right. We're going to have an awful lot of investment in infrastructure because renewables are much more variable. And if it's not things like battery storage, it is going to have to be things like pump, and that means hydro, and that's disruption. But I think what I'm worried about is that we're not having that full and frank discussion about the level of disruption that's going to be required. So we've had a massive trumpeting of ScotWind, but no one's talking about the massive infrastructure that's going to be required to connect that energy generation to the grid. There's going to be huge interconnector stations on the nearshore, big power cables. Likewise, we're going to face big decisions around what we use our land for. So I've been involved in discussions recently about whether we should be using forestry for biomass purposes or straightforwardly for lumber. Now, these are some of the big discussions that I think, frankly, and I'd hold my hands up here, collectively as politicians, I'm not sure that we have brokered that frank, honest discussion, because ultimately, as Bill points out, this is urgent. So we're going to have to make big decisions that will make about big bits of infrastructure, but also about the marginal land use, and we need to do it quite urgently and make sure that people are involved. And I think politicians have probably so far failed to do that adequately, and I think that's across the party.
Right, well, let's hear from the people involved. Gentleman in the back row.
Hi there. I do a thought for the day every morning. It's a kind of spiritual thing that I do. And today was about, from the book of Romans, believe it or not, the decay in the planet. And not just the decay, but that the earth will groan with the pangs of childbirth. And I think that's probably pretty much where we are in the earth today. The earth is groaning, and we are desperate as a human race to try and find solutions to that groaning. And I think that we need to get all of these professionals and experts together, and we need to get them to work out what is the best way forward for us. but I think we need to do something. So I'm very much in agreement that we do whatever we need to do to help us in our planet that we live on.
We should book you for Radio Scotland for that thought for the day. Gentleman in the front row here.
Okay, so we've all agreed that this is an emergency. Is this not a time for cross-party politics? Is it not a time that we sit together and have a 10-year plan rather than these 4-year plans of different governments coming in and out? And I don't just believe that for the environment. I think we should be doing that for health, and we should be doing that for education and all the big issues that we are constantly facing at this moment in time. This is an emergency. We need to be focusing on that. We need to put all our heads together, and we need to find solutions, because there are solutions out there. There are investments out there. But it just seems that we would rather have arguments just to win votes rather than sit down and actually put policy together, which is going to last.
That's what Tanya was suggesting. No, hang on a second. I want to hear from that lady there. Thank you.
Hi, it's really, Alistair, when you were saying that we need to just go for it, and then it doesn't really matter what about the land, just go for it. But do we really need to go for it on prime land, land that's near houses? These, there's so many brown sites, I can't even begin to say why you would use land the way it is. The brown sites have infrastructure already into them, whereas the land doesn't here. And also, it's near houses, they're known to go on fire, but it's okay, we just keep our windows closed. And so the people now are living with that, so they're going to be living with that. But we've just to put up with that, and our health is put at risk. Okay, but also, can I just say the Environmental briefly, Agency and Health and Safety are not being consulted at planning. It's after planning applications, it should be before. Okay. So the risks are put forward beforehand, not after when it's too late. This is going to go ahead and we'll do what we're asked to do. Okay. It should be before.
Okay, Alison Moffat.
Yeah. I'm sure that, I don't know the detail in terms of planning what brownfield sites are available and which are not, and so you obviously try and find the optimal place to do it, but I don't think anybody in this hall is arguing that it needs to be done, that we need to do it, and we need to do it in a concerted, long-term, well-planned, non-party political way. Because one of the things that I think is complicating this, and you see it on a macro level with the US and China loggerheads constantly, and yet they're the biggest polluters in a way. But what we've seen grow in the last 20 or so years is a political culture which deals not in opponents, but in enemies. It's far too sharp, all that goes on. I had reason to look at John Major giving a eulogy for John Smith when he died in May 1994, and Major made exactly this point. He said, I never saw this man as my enemy. He was always my opponent, and he admired him tremendously, and they met to talk a great deal, and sometimes had a drink, sometimes tea, sometimes not tea, and so on. And so Major, basically, and Smith, embodied a politics which I think has gone, frankly, in the last 40 years, disappeared. We need much, much more consensus, much, much more cooperation. Well, because this is a global problem.
Murmurs of agreement in the audience with that tonight. Let's see if we can channel that into the final 20 minutes of our discussion. We are in Kelso with our audience and what matters to them this evening. Next week, we're going to be in Perth. The week after that, Dunfermline. So if you'd like to come along, be part of the audience and have your say on the big issues of the day, just go to the website and apply there. Let's go to our third question tonight, which comes from Helen Ferguson. Helen.
Thank you, panel. Good evening. With the demise of NHS dentistry in Scotland, has dental treatment become the preserve of the wealthy?
Thank you, Helen. I think around 23,000 patients in the Scottish Borders have lost access to an NHS dentist between last November and July this year. What's been your own experience?
I have been with a dental practice since I was 4 years old, and earlier this year they decided that they would not be taking any more NHS patients. So I've had to change and pay a subscription monthly for payment. I'm in a position I can do that. Not everybody can. And for this to happen almost surreptitiously in Scotland is frightening. It's frightening for people who are on a fixed income, where we have energy prices escalating through the roof, for the elderly who really just cannot afford £4,000 for an implant. It just seems a shocking state of affairs that we're almost a third world country when it comes to dental provision at this moment in time.
Thank you. Thank you. Dave Dugan, wherever we go in Scotland, we have questions around this. It feels like there's a real crisis in dentistry in Scotland. It feels like it's being almost privatised by stealth.
No, I don't think that is the case, and I don't think the numbers back that up, which comes as very cold comfort to anybody who lives in an area where they're finding severe difficulty to access an NHS dentist. I think there's been an acknowledgement by the Scottish Government and NHS Scotland of the challenges, mostly around workforce within dentistry in Scotland, and there's been renewed investment into dentistry to try and improve that situation. But that work remains ongoing. It's not going to get fixed overnight, like lots of the challenges that the NHS in Scotland, and actually everywhere else, to be honest, faces. It is a lot to do with workforce planning and how we deal with that, and to take a much more longer view. That's happening now, but I really would gently push back on the inference that somehow Scotland's at the bottom of the heap when it comes to dentistry in the UK. We're very much at the top.
Daniel Johnson?
Unfortunately, Dave's answer there doesn't correspond with anyone's experience of reality. You know, it's only available in National Health if you can find a dentist that will take you, and that's increasingly difficult. And look, ultimately, I mean, the point around workforce planning is correct, but who's been in charge for the last 16 years? 16 years? The people responsible for workforce planning are the current SNP government, and they've been asleep at the wheel. And the problem is it's not just dentistry. 1 in 7 Scots are on an NHS waiting list. And the net result of all of this is that we now have record numbers of people seeking private treatment for things like orthopaedics and even for things like cancer. It is absolutely at levels that we have never seen before in this country. And the reality is getting worse.
How's this affecting our audience? Let's find out. Man with the beard.
I live in a town, it isn't a big town, and basically apparently I have a really good dentist, but a lot of people in that town wouldn't know it. They can't take new people on. And basically I feel the dentists, people live in that town, they move away, but keep the dentist, and people that move to that town can't get to it. I feel like these dentists should be made an audit and check if all their patients live in the area, because people could live miles away and move house, but still go to that same dentist and stop people in that town using it.
Rachel Hamilton.
Well, I mean, health is devolved. There are no excuses for the SNP government. Not only dentists, I get lots of emails and letters around my constituents not being able to get access to basic treatment for a dentist or having to wait a very long time. But I also know that, you know, we've seen practices, GP practices shut down, and what's happening is that services that used to be local are now further away from people, and particularly where we have an elderly population, we now see that life expectancy has dropped. And that's nothing to do with, it was actually before the pandemic that we saw these issues happening. And it is somehow a bit to do with the pandemic, but we also see...
It's also to do with Brexit, isn't it? It's also to do with
what
issues...
No,
it's
the
also
report that came, the report
well.
that talked about life expectancy did not talk about Brexit. The cancer waiting times, we know that around only 73% of people who are suspected of having a cancer diagnosis cannot get access to treatment. And the SNP government want 95% of those people to get access to quick diagnosis within around 62 days.
If this comes down to staffing, things like Brexit have played into that, because it's also a problem south of the border.
Well, I went to the NHS review meeting last week, and it was unbelievable, the fact that what the NHS in the Borders General Hospital were trying to do was look at ways of using innovation, look at ways of using international recruitment. But of course, it just happens that the SNP government are not funding the NHS properly.
That's not true.
It is. You've had the biggest block grant ever. You've got 61 billion to play with.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, hang on a second.
The NHS is devolved, and it is up to your government. Under Humza Yousaf.
NHS funding in Scotland per capita is the highest of any part of the UK. GP numbers per capita in Scotland are higher than any other part of the UK. Nurses and midwives per capita are higher than anywhere else in the United Kingdom. That doesn't mean that our services are perfect. They're not. We all know they're not. But the NHS in Scotland, what is ailing it is not a want of funding. The funding under the SNP Scottish Government over the last 16 years has consistently risen, and that's why I can say with great clarity that there is the highest funding per capita in Scotland compared with any other part of the UK.
Right,
so it's simply not
mismanagement. Let's see how that translates to the audience. Lady in the front row there.
The problem with dentists has been going on a long time. I moved back down to the borders in 2007. Before that, I had a dentist in Renfrew, and I got a lot of work done on my teeth. I mean, most of them are false teeth. It cost me a lot of money. I couldn't get it done on the NHS. I now have an NHS dentist down here. So, you know, this is a wee bit mixed up, I think, the whole thing.
Okay. Helen, who asked her question here, have you heard anything that has explained to you the situation that we're going through at the moment?
No, it's not that I can't see a dentist. I can see a dentist if I'm prepared to
pay for it.
That's the fundamental issue.
Okay.
Alistair Moffat. Isn't the issue really fundamental here? And that it's this. We're going to have to start paying for the NHS. We're going to have to start doing it. We cannot afford free prescriptions as a society. We just can't afford it. Now, means testing has a horrible reputation, but we're going to have to do it. If you can afford to pay, you should pay something. They do this in New Zealand. If you want to have a GP visit you, you have to pay $90. If you go and see a GP in a surgery, you pay $40. It's amazing the number of people who can get a lift, you know, to the surgery and pay $50 less. But they do it because it's essential to fund the service. I think we're going to have to start paying. I mean, when Tom Johnson invented the NHS in Scotland in the Second World War, he was dealing with empty hospitals for casualties that never materialised after the Clydeside Blitz and so on, and the NHS in a way started from a terrific basis. It has become so expensive, it's almost like a bottomless pit for governments. We're going to have to pay, folks. That's the political reality.
But I think...
Okay, Tanya, you've got experience of the system in Germany, obviously. What do you think?
I was about to say, so coming from a system where there were different forms of payments and a kind of insurance, and seeing how that system is also beginning to fail now, slowly, but it is, I don't think that is the answer. Having lived in New Zealand, I know that definitely isn't the answer either. So my view would be, yeah, okay, we may need to have a discussion about a different system, but I think it needs to be our discussion and what system really works for Scotland.
But do you think we should pay, though, Tanya?
I think, well, I was just about to say in my next point, really, my view is, why are we consistently ruling out raising taxes for those who have a higher salary? If we were to say that I am one of them, if we were to say that I might also be one of them, I'm fine with that.
Sure.
And I think this is a conversation everyone is shying away from for fear that there might be a few people who are not fine with this. Well, look at Norway, look at Sweden. Certain living costs are very high there, certainly to our perspective. But I think, you know, they have healthcare provisions that we don't have. So I would say this is a valid point.
I mean, we want Scandinavian levels of public services, but we won't pay Scandinavian taxes.
Yeah, but why not?
To pay for them.
Yeah, we should. Dave Dugan, Humza Yousaf has hinted that he'd be prepared to look at a higher taxation rate for certain groups. Would you agree that to pay for things like this, that's justifiable?
We already do that in Scotland, Stephen. The SNP Scottish Government are criticised continually by Labour and the Tories for the tax regime that we operate distinctly here in Scotland, whereby most people pay less tax, but if you earn more, you will pay more tax in Scotland than you will elsewhere in the United Kingdom.
To pay for services.
And we already do that because, don't let's forget, even though it seems normalised in Scotland, people south of the border pay nearly a tenner for their prescriptions. They don't get the same access to free eye tests. They don't get their children educated in university for free. That only happens here, and it happens because of the progressive taxes that the SNP have introduced over the last 16 years. And I think people of Kelso and elsewhere in Scotland are canny enough to know that you don't get anything for nothing, and you have to pay for what you get. And whilst our services, you're absolutely right, our services are not where they should be, and that journey of continuous improvement goes on relentlessly, we do pay for the NHS. Prescriptions are not free, they're funded collectively by the public purse. That is an important distinction.
Let's find out how canny the people of Kelso are. Gentleman in the middle there, yes.
Yeah, I'm just surprised that we're talking about some sort of means-tested method here for paying for the NHS, where the rich will pay slightly more, in the same week where we're talking about inheritance tax being cut, which will only benefit the top 4% of this country. How could we rely on that system when we're obviously trying to cut taxes for the rich in every other way?
Rachel Hamilton.
Well, I think Dave Dugan's being completely disingenuous, because Scotland is the highest tax part of the UK, and it's not. No. Overall, it's not a high wage to be on 28,000, and anyone in Scotland earning over 28,000 is then taxed higher than anywhere else in the whole of the United Kingdom. We have 5 income rates tax and bands. Humza Yousaf wants to bring another one. He also has a consultation on raising council tax. He wants to raise council tax for anyone in the higher bands. Now, I have constituents who live in bigger houses, but they bought their houses years ago when the original council tax review was done, and just because of the way the economy has gone, their houses have increased in value. It's not fair to tax people more to get less. The SNP are taxing people more, and we are getting less.
No, you're not.
That is
That's
an absolute
literally
fact.
the opposite of the reality.
That is a fact.
So tell that to Tory voters in England who have to pay to send their kids to university.
You tell me about the outcomes in Scotland. We've got high drug deaths, the highest in Europe. We've got the increasing alcohol deaths, the most in the UK. We have higher cancer waiting times. People who have cancer are going to pay private. There was a woman on the front page of the paper having to pay £27,000. Health is devolved to Scotland,
I know,
Dave.
but we are wrestling with the same challenges across the United Kingdom.
Outcomes
and you're
are
painting
completely
a picture
different.
where south of the border that we are very close to, it's a land of milk and honey where
Why do
everything goes
people
like
in
clockwork.
England and Wales live longer than people in Scotland?
These are cultural
Why do we have the highest drug deaths in Europe?
Issues.
I don't accept your argument.
And that is why we are called Debate Night. Your views on all of this from home. The hashtag is BBCDN. Time for one final question this evening, and it comes from Leslie Thompson. Leslie, calm things down for us this evening.
To the panel, which book have you read which has made the biggest impact on you and influenced the course of your work?
I'm going to start with author, writer, Alistair Moffat, the man who brought Genesis to this fine venue, the Tate Hall, all these years ago when he was running the Kelso Arts Festival. The book, Alistair, that has had the most impact on you and influenced the course of your work.
Yeah, I know exactly what it is, but I've just got a wee bit of a preamble. And for about 10 years, as I published 1 or 2 books every year, I got a series of anonymous letters, which were just signed Our Reader. There was no address or anything like that. And they were full of criticism. Oh, your punctuation is terrible. A dash is simply slovenly. You overuse the ablative absolute at the beginning of paragraphs. Posterity is not a synonym for history. Full of criticism, which was great, and it helped me. I mean, any author who doesn't want criticism is just an ego attached to a keyboard. But the last letter I got came inside another envelope with a compliment slip from a care home in Berwick-on-Tweed, and I reasoned that this correspondent of mine had died. I always imagined her as a wee, rather bad-tempered primary school head teacher. Anyway, she said to me, "You must read the first 20 pages of Daphne du Maurier's Frenchman's Creek. It's wonderful, because it gives an amazing sense of place in the Helston Estuary in Cornwall. Because my correspondent's message to me was, as a writer, you've just got to get out more. You've got to go to the places where history happened, you've got to go to the battlefields, you've got to go to the old roads and so on. So and it changed my life.
That's your choice. Okay, Tanya.
Well, I'm going to have to get migration in here somehow, right, as a migration historian, and because I wanted to make about immigrants and Brexit earlier, really, but I'm not going to talk about that. But it's a book by a German scholar, Klaus Bade, who is a sort of German migration historian. And what it did for me, or showed me really, is how migration is a normal part of life. And if you want to read a little bit more about my thoughts on that, you can look on my Twitter account where I wrote a thread about just this very thing last night. But what it does show us, this book, I think, or me certainly, and what motivated me then to become a migration historian myself, was really how it assessed the movement of people over time and what it told about how it's part of the normal human experience, and how if we perhaps recognize that a little bit more in our decisions, in our outlook on life, we would make better decisions and have a better outlook on life. And perhaps that connects to all the questions we've been discussing today, actually. Certainly the climate emergency as well.
Right, I hope you're all taking notes on this. Rachel Hamilton.
Okay, so, I mean, I read a wide and varied selection of books. I'm at the moment reading Nemesis by Wilbur Smith, and I'm really loving just kind of immersing myself in kind of his interpretation. Of course, he's dead now, but his new ghostwriter is immersing me in historical events, and I love that because actually sometimes it's important for a politician to get away from the kind of the nitty-gritty and the sort of you know, as you've seen today, the sort of the disagreements that the cut and thrust.
Okay,
But actually,
quickly,
my best book is there are rags to riches books and people who have turned their lives around. And I really like the writing of a Cumbrian farmer called James Rebanks, if anyone's read his
All right,
books.
30 seconds each. Daniel Johnson.
So it's slightly geeky. So I studied philosophy at St Andrews University, and so the book that really shaped my political thinking was a book called A Theory of Justice by John Rawls, which really is about how you make equality the basis of society. And my most recent book was the biography of Frank Whittle, the inventor of the jet engine. Absolutely amazing engineer and visionary man.
This is a great Christmas book list, reading list for us all, isn't it? Dave Dugan, finally.
So two, just I'm going to indulge myself, and I get two because the first one was The Silver Sword by Ian Serrelier, which I read in primary 6. And it revealed to me, I don't know how old you are in primary 6, I don't know what, 11 or 12, and it revealed that literature wasn't intensely dull. It was actually really good. But actually what I'm about to reread is a book that I read about 15 years ago and what actually kindled my ambitions in politics, and that's a book called I O U by an author called Norina Hertz. And it's all about the manipulation of the post-Soviet Russia and how sovereign debt is a noose that other people put round our neck.
Some light bedtime reading there for us. Thank you for that. That's it for tonight. We're back with you next week from Perth. You can apply to be part of the audience by going to our website. If you missed any of tonight's show, we're repeated later on BBC One Scotland, or you can watch it any time that suits you on the BBC iPlayer. Thank you very much indeed to my panel here tonight and to our wonderful audience. Great to be back in Kelso. And of course, to you at home watching, wherever you are in Scotland, we'll see you next week from Perth. In the meantime, stay safe, stay well. From all of us in Debate Night, good night.